right, it's our pleasure to have Rebecca Hankins, who's the Windler, now professor at Texas A&M University, who has specializations in Africana studies and religious studies. And we're going to be talking with her today about some of her recent research and her specialization looking especially on the African American Muslim experience and how that is intersected in issues related to the media. So Rebecca, thanks for coming and being with us today. So the first question I had is, I wanted you to describe, we talked about one of your recent chapters of the book, and I was wondering if you could kind of tell us a little bit about what is your current research project related to African American Muslims and the media, and what have you been learning?
So the book chapter that I've just submitted, hopefully it will be published within this year, is looking at the depiction of African American Muslims in film and TV, and how that depiction has affected how they identify themselves and how others identify them, and how those two intersecting identities have become really problematic for defining who African American Muslims are.
So in that work, to what extent, with what would you say is the kind of dominant stereotype that, especially in television, gets put forward about African American Muslims? And maybe you could give us a concrete example.
Well, I think most of the earlier depictions of African American Muslims depicted them as aggressive, radical, often revolutionary and rebellious, anti-American in many ways. And I think that led to this notion that they were not really Muslims. They were only using Islam as a way of separating themselves from American society. And so it led to this idea that African American Muslims were not really authentic Muslims. And so a lot of what we see in the early films and TV, when they talk about Muslims, oftentimes they were formerly incarcerated or inmates in prison. And that seemed to be a very dominant depiction of Muslims, and that African American Muslims became Muslim in prison. And so you see that as being a dominant depiction of, and they were also considered misogynist. There are always these subliminal messages about Muslims being anti-Semitic, and especially African American Muslims. And so these are all really the negative stereotypes that African American Muslims have been dealing with. And this is filtered into how they're viewed even in regular society.
So I know some of the TV shows or films that you've looked at, like the TV show Oz, you have in there both kind of Black characters as well as African American Muslim characters. So to what extent do you think that African American Muslims in the media are they portrayed similarly to kind of Black characters, or is there what's the similarities and what are maybe the differences in how they're treated and portrayed?
Well, it's interesting because in Oz, you really had a very positive depiction of an African American Muslim. And then for some reason, of course, they had to have him become this hypocrite because he had this relationship with his white lawyer, and it just spiraled into this notion that, African Americans are anti-white. They're, they're hypocrites because they're really desiring white women. And this is also played into the TV series American Crime, where you had the depiction of an African American Muslim woman who was, saying all this anti-white and anti-Semitic language. And so it was playing into that same notion that, African American Muslims have this secret uh, uh, fe- uh, relationship with whites, and it's problematic, and they're hypocrites. Her brother is with a white woman, and in American Crime, and she has this animosity towards whites. So it's always playing into these really old notions of who African American Muslims were.
So that leads into my next question, because obviously, African American Muslims both have the kind of racial narrative they have to kind of navigate, as well as this religious kind of identity, and like as you said, not really fitting into kind of our images of what a Muslim is, and also not kind of in line with we think of African Americans in line with kind of more
Right,
Baptist Methodist kind of traditions. So to
right,
what extent
right.
do you think, as far as that the experience of African Muslims are, in what ways has it been similar to blacks experiences, as far as especially of racism and just kind of it being in part of American culture, and what might be unique or different that you'd want people to understand?
Right. Well, and I do talk about this in the chapter, and I use three different scholars' work. Kathy Cohen, where she talks about that secondary marginalization theory, where African Americans, where she talked about AIDS victims who are treated very different if they're African American AIDS members. They don't exercise the same kind of power and privilege that other individuals who are in also a marginalized group. So these AIDS individuals are treated very different in the African American Muslim community. And then Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois' double consciousness, where he talks about the duality that we face being Black and American and society, and the problems that we have, and how do we identify, and how do we traverse those two identities. And then I always talk about my daughter's work, her graduate work, where she looked at African American Muslims, and she coined this idea that blends both, that double marginality, where we are not viewed, African Americans are not viewed as authentic Muslims by the Muslim community, but we're also, because we are not Christian, are not viewed in the same way by the African American community.
So if you were going to just wrap up and say a few things about this issue of the complexity of dealing with the racial tensions as well as religious tensions kind of mixed together, what do you wish people outside the African American Muslim community understood, and that either engaged with to learn more about, or to kind of became aware of about your experience, and about kind of not conflating religion and race together and making it even more complex?
Yes, absolutely. I think it is the whole notion of being authentically who you are is something that we we offer to only certain groups. Um, it's something that we as a country need, find the need to marginalize certain groups, certain people. And unfortunately, many of the people who have come here have bought into that. And so understanding who African Americans are and African American Muslims are is important to understanding how communities, are important to come together to talk about, these issues of race and racism, and how we can work to make a difference. And that needs to be portrayed.
Well, thank you, Professor Hankins, for your contribution. Thank you for all the work that you do, and thank you so much for being with us today, and really giving us a lot of fodder to think about, and raising some thought-provoking issues.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.